Welcome back to Smiddy's Learning Room. Today we continue to explore the focus question, how does the acquisition of skill affect performance? And we're going to continue having a look at the dot point, the learning environment, more specifically practice methods. So when we try to find out where practice methods comes from in the syllabus, again, it comes from that focus question of how does the acquisition of skill affect performance? It's under the dot point, the learning environment, and we're looking at practice methods. So today we're going to have a look at massed, distributed, whole and part, and we're also going to have a look at speed and accuracy practice methods as well. So obviously for a learner or an athlete to enhance their performance or reinforce their learning, they need to be exposed to a variety of practice methods, and so therefore a coach or a teacher may choose a range of different practice methods depending on the level of skill acquisition they are at. And these methods include a massed or distributed method, whole or part methods, or a speed and accuracy method. So today we're going to have a look at these 6 different methods. Now, just like the nature of the skill, several of these practice methods may be applied to a single training session. So it's important to understand that we don't single these out, but they can be applied across any training session for any athlete, depending on what stage of skill acquisition they are at. So we start by having a look at the massed practice method. Now, when we look at massed, just like before when we were looking at the nature of the skill, and we looked at mass skill or gross motor skills, we talked about the fact that gross meaning big and the same as mass meaning lots of. So when we look at mass practice, it involves long practice sessions broken up by rest periods or sort of short breaks. So this might be, say, a 2-hour training session that might have 20-minute sort of practice sessions within that 2 hours, broken up by, say, like a couple of minutes in between, just sort of for an athlete to get a drink or to reset the skill or something like that. And this mass practice is suitable for highly motivated athletes and athletes that are perhaps limited by time or travel. So basically, when we look at that sort of group or cohort of athletes, we're sort of looking at athletes at the autonomous stage or even at the associative stage of learning where the mass practice works, because they're athletes generally with higher skill level and they're able to be motivated for that period of time. So then obviously the opposite to mass practice would be distributed practice. And so distributed practice obviously looks at the fact that we're practicing a skill for shorter periods with longer periods of time or rest between the practice. So you might have only an hour training session, or say a 45-minute training session which might be broken up into, say, 10-minute training blocks. And this is suitable for athletes at the cognitive stage. And the reason for this is because they need to have shorter periods of skill development because their levels of motivation may not be as high, and also due to the nature of the cognitive stage, there's often a lot of errors that occur. So if an athlete is forced to sort of practice a skill as massed and they're making lots of errors, it may dishearten the athlete. So you've got to try and keep the athlete motivated, and this is why the distributed practice works well for athletes at the cognitive stage. It's also a good way to practice skills when mastering skills which are physically fatiguing. So, for example, a gymnast or a diver who is perhaps trying to master a somersault or something, these skills are quite demanding, and thus they're probably not going to practice that same skill for an extended period of time, hence why a distributed practice method works for that type of skill. So next we have a look at the concept of whole practice methods. And when we say whole, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's about the learner learning a skill as a whole or a complete movement. Now, this is suitable for autonomous learners or fast learners. So learners who are at that really high level of skill, who can just execute skills well without any mistakes or any sort of faults in it, because they're able to just continue to practice. Or obviously if you've got someone with quite a good natural ability or there's a relatively fast learner, they don't need to break the skill down. They can sort of see the skill being executed a few times and then go, oh, that's what I need to do. So the obviously it's suitable for skills which are difficult to separate as well. So for example, like gymnasts, trying to separate or break down the components of a somersault or a cartwheel can be quite difficult, the same as, say, trying to break down shooting an arrow in archery. So therefore, you would practice these skills as whole rather than breaking them down. So we talked about the fact that you would practice some skills as a whole skill and then maybe perhaps break other skills down. And when we look at that concept, it's part practice. So part practice methods are when skills are broken down into subroutines to allow each section to be practiced individually. And so we have that whole skill, but we break it down so that an athlete can either understand what's required in each part of the skill, or it could be quite a difficult skill which requires each little section to be mastered. And this is suitable for cognitive learners. So for example, a learner at that early stage, say of gymnastics, instead of trying to do a somersault full on, they might actually learn the process of, sort of a forward roll and then break that up further down and sort of spread it out into a somersault. Part practice is also really good for when learning a complex skill. So for example, a gymnast who is actually trying to put a serial skill together where it might be a full performance, they might break that down into the components or the individual skills of that performance. So part practice just isn't for cognitive learners, it's also for learners who are trying to execute or learn a complex skill. So the next type of practice method we can have a look at is the speed practice method. Now obviously this allows a learner to practice a skill at an ideal speed. Now it allows a learner to practice at game pace or performance pace. So not all the time is it appropriate to practice at high levels of speed, obviously due to fatigue, but also because some skills need to be broken down before speed can apply, because sometimes technique is much more efficient. And obviously when we look at who this is suitable for, speed practice is generally really only for those autonomous learners, because they've already got that high level of skill acquisition. They understand what the skill is supposed to look like, and they can actually produce it at some kind of speed and a sort of game or performance pace. Where this is an exemption is obviously for a skill that requires you to obviously be fast. So for example, if an athlete is trying to release a javelin or a shot put at slow speed, the actual acquisition of the skill won't happen, because that needs to be practice under speed or pace. Another example of this is the somersault. If a gymnast tries to perform a somersault too slow, they'll actually just fall out of the air rather than being able to complete the skill. So sometimes speed practice is suitable for people at different levels to the autonomous level of learning because of the nature of that skill. So if we're not focusing on speed for a practice method, we're obviously going to focus on accuracy. So accuracy practice focuses on performing the skill with the complete correct movements. And so this is obviously really important or suitable for people who are learning new skills, because obviously you want to try and get each part of the skill perfect or close to being accurate so that it can be performed properly. And these are obviously skills that don't require speed to learn. So for example, passing a ball or running, something where speed isn't important and more accuracy and technique is something that needs to be developed prior to speed. Hence why this is really important, this sort of accuracy practice for athletes in that cognitive and associative stage of skill acquisition, because they're still learning the skill, and without having accuracy practice, they're going to continue to have more failures and more errors, and maybe perhaps won't progress through stages of skill acquisition because they're not focusing on accuracy. So when we look at these practice methods and we sort of say, well, okay, which method is the best method to use for an athlete, it's going to depend, and obviously can vary, depending on the stage of skill acquisition that the learner or the athlete's at, the nature of the skill. So is the skill closed or opened? Is it a discrete skill or is it a continuous skill? So for example, if it's a serial skill, this might be good for part practice, whereas if it's a discrete skill, then may be better to do whole practice methods for that sort of skill. You obviously also need to take in practical considerations such as equipment and environmental conditions. So obviously depending on the equipment that is available will depend on whether you can actually break that skill down or whether you actually have to do that skill as one whole in whole practice, because you may not have the equipment or safety equipment to be able to break it down further. And then obviously the learner preference. So if you've got a learner which is a fast learner, they're probably going to prefer mass practice over distributed practice. And the same sort of thing as whole practice over part practice. If you've got a learner at the autonomous or associative stage who has a lot of natural ability, they're more likely to want to be able to practice things as a whole rather than as one. Now, interestingly, an athlete at the cognitive or associative stage may want to initially apply speed practice over accuracy practice because they have that sort of wanting, I want to be the fastest straight away. And you'll often see that coaches or trainers will actually then identify to the learner that it's actually accuracy practice which is far more important at a cognitive stage than speed practice in order for them to develop technique.